The professor crushed the paper in his hand and said, "This problem does not belong on an exam." In that instant, fate fell into the hands of a girl without a student ID. The Cambridge morning was dry and sharp, the kind that makes the wooden steps of Harvard's lecture halls creak as though they, too, are thinking. Inside one such hall, rows of students sat stiff with expectation, pencils poised. On the front desk, Professor Edwin Hale, known across campus for a rigor colder than the New England winter, shuffled through exam sheets. He paused at one page. The heading read, "The Collat's Conjecture." It was a rule stated in words. If a number is even, you divide it by 2. If a number is odd, you multiply it by 3 and add 1. Then you repeat. No one had ever proved that the process always ends at 1, though every example tested seemed to do so. Hale frowned. He crossed out the page, crushed it in his hand, and threw it into the recycling bin. "Not for an exam," he whispered. "This belongs to a lifetime, not to a grade." In the corridor, Nora Quinn followed her grandmother May, who pushed a faded cleaning cart. May had once tended the library stacks. Now retired, she cleaned classrooms part-time. "Remember," May said gently, "we only take the clean paper." Nora nodded. She liked the smell of paper, the dust of chalk and ink. It was like catching the scent of a meal when you had only ever watched from outside the kitchen door. From the bin beside the lectern, a single page slid out and landed in her hands. She smoothed it flat. The rules looked simple, but to her they were not just rules. They were movement. She borrowed May's stub of pencil and began to draw arrows. 7 climbed to 22, then dropped to 11, then up again, then down. Arrows rising and falling like birds startled from a tree. "Collat's is like hailstones," she murmured. Back in May's childhood village, sudden hailstorms would drum the tin roofs, leaving dents that lasted for years. These numbers struck just the same. Sudden leaps upward, sudden crashes downward, and at last, if the books were right, everything circled into a small loop at the end. May leaned closer. "What do you see, Nora?" "I see falling," the girl whispered. "And I see a place to hold." "A place to hold?" "Like a hinge. A door swings on a hinge. Different numbers, but they all seem to slow down at the same places." May smiled. "Hinge. That is a fine word." At the front, Hale distributed the official exam sheets. His chalk cut straight lines across the blackboard. His mind should have been on calculus. Yet he kept remembering the page he had thrown away. Collat's was something he respected like a sealed grave, a mystery never explained. He had refused to test it because it was not a problem to be graded. It belonged to patience and silence. At the back, Nora's pencil kept moving. She had chosen the number 27 without knowing why. It leapt up and up, then crashed down, then up again. She circled the spots where many different journeys seemed to touch the same stone before turning downward. She named them in her own language. Hinge points. Places where paths bowed their heads together before moving on. One student dropped a pen. It rolled across the wooden floor. Nora looked up, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met Hale's. He saw a small figure with no ID, bent over a scrap of paper, drawing arrows where others solved calculus. He looked away quickly. Yet a question stirred in him. Who is she? 10 minutes remained. Students scribbled furiously. Nora hurried too, not against the clock, but against the fear of losing what she had just heard. She darkened the arrows at her hinge points, shading them like campfires along a trail. May touched her shoulder. "Almost done, child? I want to listen a little longer. There will be other days to listen. Right now, we should not linger." Nora folded the page and tucked it inside her coat. Hale, collecting papers, paused when he saw the recycling bin was empty. The crumpled sheet was gone. He hesitated, then moved on. Some things, if they found the right hands, were not meant to be reclaimed. Later, while May wiped down the desk, Nora lingered by the blackboard. The surface was covered with integrals and symbols, but a small corner was clean. She picked up chalk and wrote carefully the rule she had read in words. Divide by 2 if even. Multiply by 3 and add 1 if odd. Stop when you reach 1. Then she drew 3 arrows converging to a single dot, pausing, then turning down. "What are you writing?" May asked. "I'm not writing," Nora said softly. "I'm asking." Asking who? The chalk. At that moment, Hale stepped back in for a scarf he had forgotten. He stopped. In the corner of the board, he saw the arrows, simple but strange, pointing to a moment of rest. On the floor lay a scrap of cardboard that had slipped from Nora's pocket, covered with dense pencil trails like a forest of paths. He did not speak. He picked up a chalk stub and wrote just 3 words beside the drawing. "Who are you?" Then he left, closing the door so gently that the latch sounded like a whisper. When Nora returned, she saw the question. She stood still, hand pressed against her coat where the folded page lay. "I am no one," she whispered. "But I can hear." She did not erase the words. She added only 1 arrow leading from her dot to a single word. "Listen." Snow began to fall outside, soft on the stone steps of Harvard Yard. May called gently, and Nora ran to her. In her pocket, the folded paper stirred like a seed shifting underground. That night, in their small, rented room, Nora laid it on the scarred wooden table. With her pencil, she circled the hinge points again, then wrote in the margin, small and private, Day 1. Colats is not just a sequence. It is how numbers learn to bow. Across town, Hale sat at his desk. On a blank sheet, he wrote a single number, 27. He drew a line, then another, then a third, as though scratching at an old memory. He did not know why the problem had returned to him. He did not know why he had written a question on the board. But he felt it. Sometimes mathematics is not calculation. It is listening. And so, the discarded exam page began its own journey. From the cold hand of a professor to the warm pocket of a girl with no student ID. In a place no one expected knowledge to grow. Between a mop bucket and a recycling cart, a new language stirred. Not applause, not spectacle, only breath. And in that quiet, the seed began to grow. It was late afternoon when Nora found room 203. The hallway lights hummed with tired electricity. Most classrooms in the building had polished brass numbers and neat schedules posted beside the door. This one was different. The door was plain, the number faintly scratched into the frame, as if the room had been added without anyone wanting to admit it. May was working 1 floor below, wiping shelves in an unused office. "Stay close," she told her granddaughter. But Nora's feet kept drifting upward. She pushed the door of 203 and it opened easily, as though the hinges had been waiting for her. Inside, the room smelled of chalk and dust. There were no rows of desks, only a wide blackboard stretching wall to wall. A few forgotten chairs leaned against the side, stacked like exiles. The room did not appear on any official schedule. It was not claimed by any professor. Nora stepped inside. The silence was not empty. It was expectant, like a breath held in the dark. She took out the folded page she had rescued and began again. Arrows climbing, arrows falling, circles where the paths touched, pauses where they seemed to breathe. By the time May came looking, the board had grown into a thicket of chalk lines. May hesitated at the doorway. "This looks like a map," she whispered. It is not a map of places, Nora said. It is a map of listening. That night, when May told her friend Frank Delgado about it, the night janitor chuckled. The kid is making better use of the room than half the faculty, he said. But be careful. Rooms like that do not stay secret once they notice you. The following week, Professor Hale sat in his office, restless. His students had done well on the exam, yet his mind kept circling back to the number 27. He had written it in his notebook, crossed it out, then written it again. 27 was notorious among mathematicians who played with the Collatz problem. It took longer than most numbers to settle down. It climbed higher, as if refusing to bow, before it finally collapsed. Hale had called it the wild seed more than once, but now the phrase troubled him. What did it mean to call a number wild? Numbers did not rebel, or did they? He closed his notebook with a snap. Perhaps I should have left that page in the exam, he muttered. Meanwhile, room 203 was changing shape. Nora discovered that chalk was not enough. She began taping blank sheets of paper to the walls, letting arrows spread in every direction. Red pencil marked the upward leaps. Blue marked the downward falls, and yellow circled the strange places where paths seemed to hover. One evening, Frank found her there. He had come to empty the trash but stopped in the doorway. The board was covered again, this time with heavy chalk marks circling the number 27. 3 times it was crossed out, then redrawn. Nora had left the chalk behind and vanished. Frank frowned, then began erasing the board. Regulations demanded a clean slate at night. Still, he hesitated when he saw the number 27 scratched faintly in the corner 3 times. For some reason, he left it untouched. Later that night, when Hale passed through the hall, he noticed the faint marks. His eyes narrowed. 3 scratches around 27. Someone else was wrestling with the same wild seed. The next morning, Hale sat through a committee meeting in the dean's office. Dean Leonard Harrow's shoes shone under the table, his voice clipped and precise. "We need visibility," the dean declared. "Donors expect progress reports, recognitions, demonstrations. Mathematics must be shown, not only done." Hale listened with half an ear. His mind strayed again to room 203 and the scratches of 27. He wondered who had made them and why he cared. After the meeting, he nearly asked Frank Delgado if he had seen anything unusual. But he stopped himself. A man of his reputation did not chase chalk ghosts. Instead, he only said, "Keep the rooms clean, Frank." Frank gave a look that was almost a smile. "Always, Professor. Though some marks don't like being cleaned away." That evening, Nora returned to the room with fresh determination. She had been dreaming of numbers bending and folding, touching one another like branches in the wind. She drew until her hands were white with chalk. Then she sat on the floor and looked at it all. "What are you telling me?" she whispered. The room did not answer in words, but the patterns stared back. Paths that began differently crossed each other before plunging down, as if some hidden rhythm called them together. She pressed her palm against the cool floorboards. For the first time in her life, she felt she was not making marks, but overhearing a language already spoken. When May came to fetch her, Nora reluctantly left, but she knew she would return. Meanwhile, in his office, Hale found himself sketching in the margin of his notes. A rising line, a sudden drop, then another rise, then a fall. 27 appeared again. He rubbed his temple. He could not shake the sense that somewhere in the building, someone else was sketching the same thing. By the end of the month, whispers had begun. A junior lecturer mentioned strange diagrams on a board with no scheduled class. A graduate student swore they saw a child leaving the room at dusk. Rumors climbed the staircase like smoke. In his notebook, Hale finally admitted a thought he had resisted. Someone else was listening to the numbers. And as for Nora, she had begun to believe something just as strange. The numbers were listening back. The morning light through the tall windows of room 203 fell like pale water across the dusty boards. Nora had slipped inside before classes began. She loved the stillness of that hour. The building seemed half asleep. Pipes groaned, floors creaked, and the smell of old wood and chalk hung in the air like incense. She set her folded page on the ledge beneath the blackboard and began to draw again. Arrows rising, arrows falling, circles where the paths touched, pauses where they seemed to breathe. Her hands moved as though the chalk itself were guiding her. But this time, she left something behind. A scrap of cardboard, the backing from an old notepad, covered with pencil trails. She had been sketching there too, tracing the wild paths. When a cart rattled in the hall, she hurried out, forgetting it on the floor. Later that same afternoon, Hale opened the door. He had come seeking quiet, but found signs of another presence. The blackboard was filled with marks, not careless, but deliberate. Arrows converging, circling, pausing. On the floor lay the piece of cardboard. Hale bent down and picked it up. The pencil lines were dense, layered, obsessive, yet not random. Whoever had made these marks had been listening to the same rhythm he himself had wrestled with for years. He stood still for a long time. Then, almost without knowing why, he lifted a chalk stub and wrote 3 words in the corner of the board. "Who are you?" The words looked foreign in his hand. He set the cardboard back on the ledge and quietly walked out. That evening, Nora returned. She had waited all day for this moment. When she saw the chalked question in the corner, her breath caught. "Who are you?" The letters were firm, written by someone used to command. Heat rushed to her face. She looked around the room as if the walls themselves had been watching. For a moment she wanted to run, but instead she stepped forward. "I am no one," she whispered. Her voice barely reached the back of the room, yet the words seemed to hang in the air. She picked up the chalk, held it with trembling fingers, and after a pause, drew one small arrow. From the circle of her diagrams, she pointed it toward a single word. "Listen." Then she left, heart pounding, following her grandmother's footsteps down the hall. For days afterward, Hale could not stop thinking about the reply. Not a name, not a defense. Only the word, "listen." He found himself glancing at the back of lecture halls, not for his students, but for a small figure who did not belong. Once he thought he glimpsed her moving quickly beside a cleaning cart, but when he turned, she was gone. Whoever she was, he knew one thing. She was not guessing. She had seen the same patterns that haunted him. She had noticed the same stubborn pauses around 27, the same breath hidden in the numbers. How could a child see what most of his colleagues ignored? Nora, meanwhile, felt both frightened and alive. Someone had noticed her. Someone had spoken back. For the first time, she realized her drawings were not invisible. They could be questioned, claimed, even stolen. She carried the cardboard more carefully now, pressing it against her chest each night. At supper, May noticed the way her granddaughter's hands lingered on her coat pocket. "You have been somewhere again, haven't you?" Nora lowered her gaze. "I found a room, and in it, someone found me back." May set down her teacup. "Be careful, child. A voice is precious. You must learn how to guard it before you let others use it." "I did not speak, Grandma. I only listened." May's eyes softened. "Listening can be dangerous too, because it tells others you may have something worth saying." 2 nights later, Frank Delgado was mopping the hall when he heard faint chalk tapping inside room 203. He opened the door a crack. Hale stood at the board, tracing the strange marks with his fingertip. Frank cleared his throat. "Professor, that room is not on the schedule." Hale turned. For a moment, his face looked softer than Frank had ever seen. "No, it is not," he said. After a pause, he added, "Have you seen who has been working here?" Frank shook his head slowly. "Rooms keep their own secrets. I only clean them." When Hale left, Frank whispered to himself, "It is the girl." He would not betray her. Yet he knew the day was coming when her secret would no longer be hers alone. The next morning, Hale walked across Harvard Yard as snow fell in slow flakes. He remembered his own boyhood, years before titles and deadlines, when numbers felt like companions. Back then, he had listened, not just calculated. Somewhere along the way, academia had demanded proof and publication, and he had nearly lost the skill of listening. Now, on a blackboard in a forgotten room, a child had given the word back to him. That afternoon, Nora returned to room 203 again. The chalked question was smudged, but she could still see its ghost. She did not add anything this time. She simply stood before the board, cardboard pressed to her chest, and whispered into the silence. "If you keep asking, I will keep listening, but do not ask my name. I do not have one that matters here." The room received her words, and though she stood alone, she felt less alone than ever before. The day began quietly. May and Nora pushed the canvas cart through Harvard's long corridor. The wheels squeaked softly against the tiles. Nora slowed when she passed a seminar room. Voices carried through the door. Grown voices. Sharp, hurried, layered with authority. She should have walked past, but she stopped to listen. Inside, Professor Hale stood at the board. 3 colleagues surrounded him. They were speaking of progress, of demonstrations, of donors. Hale's chalk moved across the slate. He had brought with him the strange diagrams copied from room 203. He did not say where they came from. He simply drew them. Arrows rising, falling, circling, then pausing at the same spot. "Look here," Hale said. 3 different beginnings, yet all slow at the same hinge before descending. One professor laughed. "This looks like doodles." Another smirked. "This is your contribution? Children's sketches?" In the corner, Lydia Chen tilted her head. She was quiet by nature, and when she spoke, people listened. "She is not wrong," Lydia said gently. The room hushed. Still, the others muttered about rigor, about proof, about the danger of metaphor. Then Hale did something no one expected. He walked to the door and opened it. "If you will not listen to me," he said, "then listen to the one who drew them." And there in the hallway, pale and startled, stood Nora Quinn. May's hand flew to her mouth. She had told Nora to remain invisible. Yet the professor himself was beckoning her inside. "Nora," Hale said softly, "come in." Nora froze. She had no right to be there. No badge, no title. Only the folded paper in her pocket and chalk dust on her fingers. But Hale's eyes did not command. They invited. She stepped through the doorway. The professors stared, surprised. One whispered too loudly, "Is this a faculty child?" Hale gestured to the board. "These marks are hers. If you dismiss them honestly." For a long breath, Nora said nothing. Her throat was dry. Then she picked up the chalk. Its sound against the slate was sharp at first, then steadier. She drew 3 paths. Each one rose, then fell, then all paused together before bending down. She circled the pause. "Here," she said. "They breathe. They take a pause together, even if they began far apart." One professor scoffed. "Numbers do not breathe." Nora turned. Her voice was quiet but firm. No, but people do. And if numbers guide us, perhaps we should notice when they pause. Silence filled the room. It was not agreement. Not yet. But it was not dismissal either. Lydia stepped closer. She studied the chalk marks with care. She is not wrong, Lydia repeated. Call them hinges or common pauses. They are there, and if she sees them first, we should listen. The others shifted in their chairs. One muttered again about proof, but Hale stood straighter than he had in years. Mathematics begins with intuition, he said. Proof comes later. If you laugh at the seed, you will never taste the harvest. When the meeting ended, the professors drifted away, coats rustling. Some frowned, some shrugged. Only Lydia remained. She looked at Nora, then at May, who had entered to stand by her granddaughter. Keep drawing, Lydia said simply. Then she left. May exhaled. Child, do you know what you have done? Nora lowered her eyes. I did not want to speak. I only wanted to listen. But you spoke, May said. And once words leave your mouth, the world will not give them back. That night, Nora lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of their rented room. She replayed the scene again and again. The laughter, the silence, the soft defense of Lydia Chen. She wondered if she had made a mistake. But she also remembered the faces, even the skeptical ones, turning toward her. For the first time, people with titles and books had listened to a girl with no credentials. Not because she demanded it, because the numbers demanded it. Meanwhile, Hale sat alone in his office. He thought of the silence that had followed Nora's words. Silence was rare in faculty meetings. That silence meant something. The first hinge has turned, he whispered. Doors swing open when grown men smell the presence of genius, and the shadow they cast is longer than any hallway at Harvard. The knock came sooner than anyone expected. May was scrubbing the marble steps near the entrance when a man in a pressed suit leaned down. Is that your granddaughter I saw in Hale's seminar? His smile was polite, but his eyes were sharp. We would love to speak with her. May straightened. She is only a child. A child, the man repeated, rolling the word as if it were only a temporary stage. But an unusual one. There is talk of diagrams, of intuition. The department is buzzing. Would it not be good for her? A chance to be recognized? May wrung out her mop, water dripping gray onto the stone. Recognition is not food. It does not keep the heat on in winter. The man gave a courteous nod. Still, the world is always eager for a story. His shoes clicked away like punctuation marks on the marble. That evening, Professor Hale was called to a meeting in the Office of Public Affairs. The proposal was clear. They wanted to present the young prodigy who had wandered into Harvard's halls, a press release, a filmed interview, perhaps even a staged lecture with the girl at the center. Dean Leonard Harrow delivered the message himself. His hands were folded, his voice smooth. This is an opportunity. The institution gains visibility. Donors are pleased. The faculty receive recognition. And of course, the child will be guided, structured, mentored. He looked at Hale as though the role had already been assigned. Hale frowned. She is not a mascot. Professor, the dean replied, genius is a resource, and resources must be used. Hale tightened his jaw. He knew this argument. For years, numbers had been stripped of mystery and turned into currency. Grants, rankings, prestige. But numbers to him were alive. And this girl had heard them breathe. He left the office with his scarf drawn tight against the cold. His thoughts weighed heavier than the air. At home, Nora sensed the shift in May's face before her grandmother spoke. "They will want you on a stage," May said softly. "They will dress you in words that are not yours. They will call you a prodigy. Later, they will call you a problem when you do not fit their shape." Nora pressed the scrap of cardboard to her chest. "I do not want a stage. I want a room. I want chalk." May touched her cheek. "Then hold to that. Do not let anyone use your voice before you know how to protect it." Still, the offers came. One afternoon, a young administrator appeared at the cleaning closet with a camera crew. They insisted they only wanted a glimpse of the girl who sees patterns. Frank Delgado blocked the doorway with his mop bucket. "She is not a circus act," he said flatly, sending them away. A graduate student left a note under Hale's door. "If the girl will collaborate, we can secure a publication. She can be listed as second author or even anonymous." Hale tore the note in half. The pressure mounted. Even Lydia Chen stopped Hale in the hallway. "Edwin," she said, "they will not let this go. The dean smells opportunity. If you shield her too fiercely, you may drive them harder. Sometimes the best protection is to choose the terms before someone else does." Hale nodded but said nothing. He was torn. For years he had scolded students for hiding their work. Yet faced with this child, who had never asked for notice, he felt only the urge to shield her. One evening, Nora returned to room 203. The blackboard was wiped clean. That was not unusual. Frank often erased it at night, but this time, taped neatly at eye level, was a typed notice. "This room is reassigned for scheduled courses. Please remove all materials." Nora stared at the words. Chalk still in her hand, she did not move. The room that had been her shelter was no longer hers. May found her there, shoulders bent. "Child," May whispered, "a room can be taken, but the breath of numbers cannot. They will find you again." Nora pressed her palm against the cold slate, as though saying goodbye to a friend. Meanwhile, the dean pressed harder. "We must act quickly," Harrow insisted in a second meeting with Hale. "The public story is half written already. A janitor's granddaughter, Harvard's hidden genius. Imagine the headlines." Hale's voice cut sharp. "Imagine the cost. Do you know what happens when you put a seed under floodlights? It dies." The dean waved a hand. "Spare me the metaphors, Professor. The child will be guided and managed. It will be good for her. And for us." Hale rose from his chair. "Good for you, perhaps. For her, you know nothing, and you will not use her while she is under my care." The dean's smile thinned. "Be careful, Edwin. Defiance has consequences." Back in their small rented room, Nora sat with May beside the heater. The cardboard lay on the table, covered with arrows of rise and fall. May poured tea. "They will promise you the world, but promise is not peace. Remember that." Nora nodded, though her chest ached. She wanted to learn, to draw more, to hear the hidden breath of numbers. But she also wanted to stay unseen, safe in silence. The two desires pulled at her like tides. Before sleep, she whispered into her pillow, "Please, no stages, only listening." The door of room 203 was locked. The notice remained taped across the wood in crisp black letters. "This room is reassigned for scheduled courses. Please remove all materials." Nora stood outside, chalk in hand. Her fingertips were dusted white. She had hoped the notice was temporary. She had hoped the door would still open if she turned the knob softly enough. But it did not. May's hand rested on her shoulder. "Child, rooms belong to them, but the work belongs to you." Nora pressed her cheek to the cool wood, as if listening for a heartbeat inside. Silence answered. She slipped the chalk back into her pocket and followed May down the hall. That night she could not sleep. The walls of their small rented room seemed too close. The heater ticked and groaned. The folded cardboard on the table looked tired under the yellow lamp. Finally she rose, pulled on her coat, and stepped into the night. She walked 3 blocks to an old garage at the edge of Somerville. The building had been abandoned long ago. Its windows were dusty. Its floor was cracked cement. But it was empty. It was hers. Nora dragged in a stack of discarded paper from May's cart. She taped the sheets along the wall, a pale patchwork, white bricks of possibility. She drew the first arrow in red pencil, marking the upward leaps, then blue for the downward falls, yellow for the places where paths circled like dancers before turning. The wall grew into a garden of color. When Frank Delgado found her there one night, he whistled low. "So this is where you went." His eyes moved across the walls, paper upon paper, arrows upon arrows. Nora did not turn. She kept drawing. "They closed my room." Frank set down his mop bucket. "A room can be closed. But you, kid, you build another." He pointed to a cluster of yellow circles where different paths bent together. "What do you call this?" "Common turns," Nora whispered. "They do not meet at the same number, but they all change direction in rhythm, like breath shared." Frank nodded. "Looks like music to me." Meanwhile, at Harvard, Hale felt the loss of room 203. Its walls were silent now. He walked past it often, feeling a hollowness, as if someone had stolen a page from his own notebook. In faculty meetings, Dean Harrow spoke of appropriate structures and controlled mentorship. But Hale's mind drifted. Where had the girl gone? Was she still drawing? Or had the silence of locked doors smothered her gift? Late at night, he found himself sketching again. His pen moved without permission. Rises, falls, pauses. He realized he was not alone in missing the room. The work had escaped its walls. In the garage, Nora's wall grew higher. She switched to crayons when the pencils wore down. Red, blue, yellow, even green. Each color carried a mood. Red shouted. Blue sighed. Yellow circled like a question. Green traced the moments when numbers seemed to echo one another. She worked until her hands were stained. At times, she stepped back and closed her eyes. She heard not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting. A rhythm that was not hers, but wanted her attention. May brought her thermos of soup and watched quietly. "You are building a cathedral," May said softly, "but with paper and crayon." "It is not mine," Nora replied. "I only follow the breath." One night, as snow tapped against the dusty windows, Nora paused at a strange discovery. Different paths that began far apart never landed on the same number, yet they often bent in unison, as if turning together at invisible corners. She marked these with circles of yellow and wrote above them, "Shared rhythm." Her chest ached as she stared. It felt like finding a hidden choir. Not voices blending, but voices breathing together before moving apart again. She whispered, "Numbers bow even when they do not meet." Back at Harvard, Hale received a quiet note. Slipped under his door in Frank's steady handwriting, it read, "The girl has moved. 3 blocks east. Old garage. If you want to know, go see." Hale sat at his desk, the note in hand. He thought of the laughter of his colleagues, the warnings of the dean, the silence that had followed Nora's first trembling words. He thought of 27, the wild seed that refused to bow, and of the chalked word she had left him. Listen. He folded the note carefully. He would go. Winter deepened. Harvard's buildings stood under snow like stern guardians. Inside the math department, another kind of frost was spreading. Dr. Victor Ames, a young researcher with sharp features and sharper ambition, had noticed the whispers. Strange diagrams. A girl without status. A professor uncharacteristically protective. To him, it was not a mystery. It was an opportunity. He studied the scraps Hale had shared reluctantly in one closed meeting. Curved arrows, circles of paws, clusters of paths bending together. Ames smiled to himself. A new framework, he murmured, and the one who names the framework is the one remembered. Emails began to move quietly through the department, plans for a preliminary paper, drafts that spoke of a new symbolic system for the Collatz process. At the top of each draft appeared the names of senior researchers. At the bottom, one line was left open to be filled later with contributing author. But no one wrote the name that mattered. Nora's name was nowhere. In the garage, Nora kept drawing. She had no idea of the schemes unfolding above her. Her crayons bled into the paper until her fingertips were stained. She whispered to herself as she drew, upward, downward, pause, breathe. May sat nearby, knitting with tired hands. She watched her granddaughter build her forest of lines and colors. Sometimes May wondered if the world outside could understand this at all. One night, Frank slipped into Hale's office. His coat was dusted with snow. He set a folded note on the professor's desk. Tonight, Frank said simply. Look at room 203. Hale opened the note after Frank had gone. Inside was a copy of an email. The words chilled him. Standardize the child's notation. Establish a coherent framework. Publish quickly under faculty guidance. Hale gripped the paper. He knew what it meant. Ames was moving fast. If they published first, the girl would vanish from her own work. Later that night, Hale walked the dark halls of the department. Room 203 was dark, locked, and silent. Yet through the small window he saw faint light on the blackboard. Shapes had been drawn there again, not by Nora this time, but by Ames and two colleagues. The board carried her marks, rewritten in careful academic style, stripped of color, stripped of breath. Circles had become nodes. Arrows had become edges. Her hinge points were labeled as transition conditions. Hale's chest tightened. They had taken the music and turned it into bookkeeping. He stood outside the door, fists clenched, while the men inside spoke in low voices. We can submit within a month, Ames said. The framework is ours now. Meanwhile, in the garage, Nora felt uneasy. She did not know why. Her crayons scratched against the paper, but the rhythm felt faint, as if something were interfering. She pressed her hand against the wall of drawings. Are you still here? She whispered. The silence felt heavier than usual. May looked up from her knitting. What troubles you, child? I do not know, Nora said. It feels like someone is speaking for them. And the numbers grow quiet. May laid her hand gently on the girl's shoulder. Remember, no one can own a voice that comes from listening. They can only steal paper. They cannot steal breath. Back in his office, Hale stared at the copy of the email again. He felt the old ache in his chest, the one he had carried through decades of politics and committees. He had watched too many ideas stripped, repackaged, and stolen. He would not watch it happen again. He pulled out a fresh sheet and wrote 5 words at the top. Protect the child, protect the work. Then he folded the page, slipped it into his coat, and stepped out into the falling snow. Snow drifted over Cambridge like sifted flour. Street lamps hummed in the cold air. Hale followed the address Frank had slipped him on a folded scrap of paper. 3 blocks east. An old garage. He found it easily. The door sagged on its hinges. Frost coated the glass panes like cataracts. For a moment he hesitated, wondering what right he had to step inside. Then he pushed the door. The smell of dust and paper greeted him. The light was dim, a single bulb dangling from a cord. But the walls were alive. Sheets of paper covered them from floor to ceiling. A patchwork of white, scribbled with red, blue, yellow, and green. Arrows climbed, arrows fell, circles lingered like pauses in music. Hale stood frozen. He felt as though he had stepped into a river, each sheet a current flowing past him. Nora knelt near the far wall. Her small hand moved steadily across the paper with a crayon. May sat on a stool, knitting quietly, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. When Nora turned, her face did not show fear, only calm. She lifted the crayon, pointed to a cluster of circles, and said softly, "This is the common turn. They do not meet at the same place, but they all change direction together. I did not invent it. I only heard it." Hale felt his throat tighten. "You listen," he said. Nora nodded. "I listen. They speak." He stepped closer. The colors blurred before his eyes. For decades he had written equations, chased proofs, and defended rigor. Yet here, in this cold garage, the same problem looked different. It looked alive. He touched one of the papers lightly with his fingertip. "This is not a guess. This is a frame, a new way of seeing." Nora shook her head. "Not new, just uncovered. Like lifting dust from glass." May's needles clicked softly. She did not look up. "If you mean to help her, Professor, do it without putting her under lights she cannot bear." Hale lowered his hand. "I will not betray her. Not to the dean, not to Ames." For a long time the three of them stood in silence. The only sound was the ticking bulb and the faint scrape of crayon on paper. Then Hale spoke again. "Before this work appears anywhere, it needs a safe place. A place where understanding can grow, not be stolen." Nora tilted her head. "A place without stages?" "Yes," Hale said. "Without stages. Only chairs. Only listening." She studied him. Then, as if testing his promise, she handed him one sheet. On it was drawn a series of paths bending in unison before breaking apart. At the top, she had written 2 words in careful handwriting. "Shared breath." Hale held the paper as though it were fragile glass. He did not try to correct it. He only nodded. When he left the garage that night, the snow had deepened. He walked slowly, scarf wrapped tight, mind burning. He thought of Ames, already preparing to publish. He thought of Harrow, eager for headlines. And he thought of the girl, kneeling in a cold garage, hearing numbers breathe. He whispered to the dark street, "We must protect this. Not for credit. For truth." Winter pressed harder on Cambridge. Snow turned the yard into a quilt of white. The students hurried from building to building, their breath fogging in the air. Inside the North Rotunda, a quiet gathering began. Professor Hale had called it. Not the dean, not the Office of Public Affairs. Just Hale, with a few invitations slipped quietly to those he trusted. No cameras, no reporters, only a circle of chairs. At the center of the circle was one empty seat. Faculty whispered among themselves. Some were puzzled, some skeptical. Lydia Chen sat calmly, hands folded, her eyes on the vacant chair. Frank Delgado leaned against the back wall, his mop tucked away, pretending to be part of the cleaning staff but listening closely. May arrived with Nora. The girl hesitated at the door. Her grandmother touched her arm. "You choose," May whispered. "You can walk in, or we can walk away." Nora looked into the room. The empty seat glowed under the soft light. She stepped forward. When she entered, the murmurs stopped. Hale stood. "This meeting is not for performance," he said. "It is for listening. No stage, no spotlight, only a circle." He gestured to the empty seat. "It belongs to no one. Whoever sits here speaks without interruption. When they finish, the chair is empty again." Nora did not sit. Instead, she opened her worn notebook and turned to the last page. She stood holding it, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we measure only the leaps and the falls, we will miss the place that holds them still. There is always something that does not move. It is small, but it keeps everything from flying apart." She placed the notebook gently on the empty chair. Then she stepped back. Silence filled the rotunda. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of weight. One professor shifted, uneasy. Another frowned as if searching for the right question. But no one spoke. The chair with the notebook seemed to command its own authority. Lydia Chen was the first to move. She walked to the chair, picked up the notebook, and read the last line aloud. "If we measure only the leaps and the falls, we will miss the place that holds them still." She closed the book and placed it back on the chair. Then quietly, she sat down. The circle seemed to breathe together. Frank Delgado, leaning in the shadows, whispered to himself, "About time." May's eyes glistened. She squeezed Nora's hand. "They are beginning to hear you." But Nora shook her head. "Not me. The numbers." When the gathering ended, no one spoke of publishing, or headlines, or donors. They filed out in quiet steps, leaving the chair at the center empty once more. Hale stayed behind. He placed his own notes beside Nora's notebook. "This chair," he said softly, "does not belong to any one of us. It belongs to listening." That night, back in the garage, Nora taped another sheet to the wall, a spiral opening outward. At the bottom she wrote in her careful hand, "The language is still learning how to say thank you." She stepped back and smiled faintly. The garage seemed to answer with its own silence, the kind that heals. Morning light fell across the yard, clear after a night of snow. In room 203, the blackboard carried new writing. Someone had chalked a single sentence. "This seat has no name. Whoever sits here will not be interrupted." No signature, no explanation. Only words, steady and white. When students arrived, they paused. When faculty passed, they read in silence. By afternoon, the message had spread across the department. A rule had been born, not by vote, but by presence. Dean Leonard Harrow entered later that day. He frowned at the chalk. "Who wrote this?" he demanded. No one answered. The silence in the room was heavy, almost defiant. He turned to Hale. "This is disorder. We cannot let a child set the terms of our discourse." Hale's voice was calm. "This is not disorder. It is order of another kind. A community that agrees to listen before it speaks." The dean bristled. But the weight of the gathered faculty, even the younger ones, pressed back against his authority. For once, Harrow felt himself the intruder. Meanwhile, Dr. Victor Ames prepared his draft for publication. He had reshaped Nora's diagrams into tidy boxes and sterile graphs, but when he presented it at a faculty review, the reaction was cold. "Where is the voice?" Lydia Chen asked quietly. "Where is the listening?" Hale added. The draft was withdrawn. Ames folded the pages in silence, his ambition bruised. That evening, Hale left a note in the faculty office. "If the girl returns, do not ask her for performance. Ask instead what the numbers sound like when no one speaks over them." In the garage, Nora taped another spiral to the wall. This one opened wider than the others, stretching outward like arms extended. At the bottom, she wrote in careful letters, "The language is still learning how to say thank you." May stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Child, your work has already spoken. The rest will follow in its time." Nora pressed her palm against the paper. She did not dream of applause. She dreamed of breath. She dreamed of silence that heals. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Nora's journey. If this story has brought you a moment of warmth, a pause to breathe, or a spark of memory, we invite you to stay with us for the next chapters to come. You can subscribe gently, without hurry, so that each new story finds its way to you in time. Until then, may the silence around you be kind, and may listening always bring you peace.